Welcome to episode 15 of Feeling Through Live. I am very excited to be talking with Brian Switzer today from Perkins School for the Blind. He's a marathoner. He's lived a very interesting and diverse life. Brian, there's so much to talk about today. Obviously the 30th anniversary of the ADA is in a couple days. So certainly I want to touch on that. But I'd love to just hop right into your life. Let's just go all the way back. Why don't we just start at the very beginning of little baby Brian and you take us back? But yeah, I'd love to, I'd love to hear just kind of about your early childhood to kind of orient everyone to you. You've had such an interesting journey from then to now. So I know that's I didn't even ask you how you're doing yet. I'm just asking you to talk about being a little, why don't we start there? First, let's start there actually, Brian. I love to ask guests, this has been a distinctly unique time here. How have you been feeling through these last several months? What's your experience been?
Yeah, it's going really well. My wife and I were pretty fortunate to, be doing, staying healthy and doing quite well through the coronavirus and everything that's going on in the world. So we're doing great.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Certainly it's a time where it's very challenging for a lot of people, but I'm glad to hear in the cases where people are also doing well, because it's also a time for a lot of people. It's been a really useful time to learn new things or kind of address certain things that maybe they didn't normally have time to get to. But I'm glad to hear you're doing well. So yeah, let's hop right into it though. Let's go back to, can you kind of just take me through the earliest years of your life here, and there's a lot that I know springs off of that to get to, but why don't we just go all the way back there?
Yeah, definitely. As you guys probably already know, I do have deaf blindness. I have severe hearing loss, and I can only make out a little bit of light visually. And that's because of a genetic condition called Usher syndrome. You're born with it, obviously. And I was first diagnosed with hearing loss at the age of 2. They noted that I wasn't speaking at the normal rate. It took me a while to actually begin speaking. And so my parents actually started me on the path of learning sign language as my primary language. So I actually started off at a school for the deaf as a child. I went to the Boston School for the Deaf, which unfortunately is no longer in existence. And then after that, I moved to the Learning Center. And then after that, I transitioned into a public school with a intervener. So I was diagnosed with hearing loss at age 2, and then the vision piece, I was actually diagnosed really young for someone with Usher syndrome. I was diagnosed with vision loss at the age of 4, and that was because I had difficulty reading the blackboard. Back in the day, I don't know if people remember, before whiteboards, there were a thing called blackboards where you had chalk, colored chalk, and that contrast was really difficult for me to make out. My teacher also noticed that when I would enter in a room, if the lights were too bright, I would be suddenly blinded by the light, and I would pause for a second, which is very unusual for a child to all of a sudden stop moving. So at the school for the deaf, they were pretty familiar with Usher syndrome. So the teacher that we recommended that I go see a specialist and get my eye checked and make sure that my eyes are okay. Unfortunately, you know, I end up being diagnosed with vision loss. Usher syndrome affect your hearing, but also affect your retinas. And so there's no cure or anything for Usher syndrome, and a progression of vision loss. It starts on the outside, and then you, over the year, form tunnel vision, and then eventually that tunnel vision closes up. Some people are very fortunate and they live their entire life with some usable vision, and that's wonderful for them. My vision started closing up. I started losing that central vision at the age of 24, so I had learned how to adapt after that.
Great. So I'm gonna just to go back to that moment. You said your parents first learned of your hearing loss at the age of 2, and then at the age of 4 is when the Usher syndrome diagnosis was made. Right?
Yeah.
So what I guess just from as much as you can speak for your parents, how would you articulate their experience having knowing that obviously first at 2 learning of your hearing loss, and then at 4 finding out that you were also going to lose your vision. Have you had discussions with them or have a good finger to your pulse of like what their experience was like at that time?
Yeah, we've had a lot of dinner discussions about what it was like when I was a child. One thing that my parents found was having reached out to people in the deaf community, they were able to kind of figure out that I could lead a fairly normal life. They talked to a priest called Father Murphy who had significant hearing loss. He was living a normal life, and he told my parents to, hold me to high expectations and kind of let me live out a normal life. I think in my parent view, they would have kept me in bubble wrap if they had their way. Um, but I was a kind of a strong-headed child and kind of wanted to do my own thing. So actually, when I was age 4, I lied and told the teacher that I knew how to swim, and I didn't. And I actually learned how to swim just by jumping in the deep end of the pool and kind of had to teach myself how to swim. And unfortunately, that was the kind of stuff my parents had put up with when I was a child.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love this, and I think as we kind of get further into this conversation, we'll see that little anecdote you have about lying that you could swim and just jumping into the pool and figuring it out feels very much like a larger metaphor for how you've lived your life, and at least the prior conversation I got to have with you. So I love that's such a like you couldn't come up with a better mini story to like kind of embody like a theme, one of the major themes of your life. But I love that idea too. The fact that there are parents who obviously, like any parent, want to have the best for their kid and make sure their kid is safe and well taken care of. And certainly, like any parents of a young child, would have anything that seems like it could pose a quote unquote extra threat to your child would be something that could be a touchy thing. But you didn't really give them a chance to pin you down there. You were just who you were as a child. They just kind of had to roll with the punches. It sounds like.
Yeah, exactly.
And do you have any siblings?
Can you repeat the question?
Do you have any siblings?
I do. I actually have 3 brothers, and I think that helped a lot. We were always getting in trouble together. We did a lot of things that normal siblings would do. My parents always expected them to include me in everything. So if they were going, roller skating with their friends, my parents expected them to bring me along. So I was always able to be fully included in my family. They never treated me any different, and I think it shaped a lot of the way that my brothers have grown up. They would be the first one to help someone with a disability that they saw on the street. Being familiar with the deaf community, the blind community, and the deaf-blind community, they know how to assist people in ways that the average hearing-sighted person wouldn't know how to interact with someone. And they're obviously all hearing-sighted.
So let's see. So you have 3 brothers who are hearing and sighted, and you have Usher syndrome and are deaf blind. So is that what were the odds of any one of of your siblings having Usher syndrome?
So it's pretty funny. It's actually a 1 in 4 chance, and I just happen to be the 1 in 4.
So you literally like hit that percentage right on the dot there. It sounds like the Switzer family. What was that? I mean, you said there, from a young age, your parents, encouraged all of you to kind of partake in all the activities together. And it sounds like, your brothers treated you like any of their other brothers. Did you ever find at any point growing up that your brothers felt like more protective of you, or felt like there was a need to be, or was that not really part of your dynamic with your brothers?
They definitely would have helped me out in any way that they could. I never felt like I needed protection. You know, most of my classmates treated me pretty well. I don't think anyone really treated me any different. They were always fascinated that I knew sign language. So that was a tool that I was able to use in my favor because I had friends who were interested in learning sign language. It was the fascinating language that they were, not familiar with, obviously. So I never felt unsafe or anything. I always had a good group of friends who watched out for me.
Well, I imagine the 4-year-old that is going to lie to their teacher that they know how to swim and jump in the pool and learn, doesn't really need like doesn't isn't the type of kid that needs other people to look out for them. It sounds like.
Yeah, definitely.
So did your family all learn how to sign?
So the majority of my family knows how to sign. Both my parents and my two older brothers also sign language classes when I was a kid. A couple of my cousins have learned sign language. My younger brother in college ended up learning sign language. He was so much younger than me that at the time he didn't learn sign language, but he knows a little bit now. It's really fascinating. I went to a thing maybe 5 years ago with my older brother DJ, and I was really impressed. He was able to sign and have a conversation back and forth with someone who was deaf, and it really blew me away because he almost never uses it, but something in his brain from when we were kids, it kicked in, and he was able to sign away.
And you talked about initially going to the Boston School for the Deaf, and then you transitioned to the public school system. What was the main reason for that transition there?
So the Boston School ended up closing, which is why we transferred over to the Learning Center. And my parents were one of the main advocates for opening the Learning Center. They had a location, but they ended up opening one near us for that specific reason to move a lot of the kids who were attending the Boston School for the Deaf into the Learning Center. So they were a great advocate at that moment. And then the academics in the schools that I went to weren't challenging me enough. So my parents really wanted me to attend public school where I could be challenged a little more academically and compete with my peers. And I always did really well in school. Obviously, even now I'm completing a second master's. So I really enjoy school and it comes easily to me. So my parents just want to give me a little bit more of a challenge and be more integrated with my peers.
So you mentioned that like it sounded like you had like a pretty good child in the sense that when you're mentioning like your peers treating you quite well. But did you find any distinction between your peers at the Boston School for the Deaf and then when you went to public school? Did you find any kind of different dynamics between the other kids in your class?
Yeah, one key different. I found it really difficult when I first transferred to public school because everyone's speaking at the same time. When you're in a group of people who are deaf, only one person is really signing at a time, and everyone's attention is focused on that one person, probably because it's so visual. When I went to public school, all of a sudden there were, 10, 15 people speaking at once, and that was really challenging. I also found it different in culture. People who are deaf tend to sit together a lot more than the general public. So that was a big change. Overall, though, at the end of the day, people are people. At school for the deaf or in public school, you have really intelligent people, really nice people, really kind people. You should get to know all sorts of walk of life.
Yeah. And did you find like just as far as that dynamic goes, did you find that like your friends and peers in public school started to learn when you were like in a group with them talking to like talk more one at a time and not all at the same time? Did they make certain adjustments in that sense?
Yeah, a lot of my peers were really good at, speaking at me, making sure I could read the lip. At the time, I was able to read lip. Obviously, where my vision is at now, I wouldn't be able to read lips anymore. But at the time, people were really good at making sure they got my attention, tapping me on the shoulder, speaking directly at me. And so they adjusted in order to accommodate me, which was wonderful.
And so, a really important part from I remember from our conversation before, when you're at the public school at this point, you're obviously like, you know, having, you have good relationships with your peers, you're doing very well in school. But can you tell us what an intervener is and how your intervener played a role in your educational experience?
Yeah. So in the deafblind community, we have the thing called intervener, and they work one on one with someone who's deafblind. So when I transitioned from a school for the deaf to public school, one of the main challenges was my difficulty in hearing. So she would hired as an interpreter. So she would sit next to the teacher and interpret into sign language everything that the teacher was saying. In addition to that role of accommodating for my hearing loss, she would also make sure I had accommodations in place. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier that I couldn't read a blackboard. So, she'd make sure that my classroom for the following year had a whiteboard in it. It was pretty unpopular at the time. Now, I think every classroom out there has a whiteboard or a smart board in there. And she would do other things too. So, she would make sure I was able to use erasable pens in math class rather than a pencil. She would make sure that the grid lines on the paper were bold and big, that were easier for me to see. She would make sure that the lighting was appropriate for my vision loss. She would make sure that um, I had access to wide print. So I took a few exams and they were usually in large print, so it's easier for me to read and see. She did a lot of things on that nature. It was kind of double duty between making sure that my hearing loss needs were met and my vision loss needs were met.
And so the intervener, and what was your intervener's name?
Debbie Winkler.
Debbie. So Debbie, your intervener, Debbie, it's the same intervener that's with you day in and day out. Is that correct?
Yeah. So she was the only one. She was with me day in and day out. We actually worked together from the time I was in first grade all the way to the end of college. So we
Wow.
actually worked together on a daily basis for 16 years straight, which is pretty
16.
unbelievable. I don't know very many people that work with someone for that long and that intimately.
That's unbelievable. I mean, that's such an interesting relationship there. So let me just see if I have this straight. So you have an intervener, who is someone who's both helping facilitate various things that need to happen in class, and sometimes advocating for certain things like a whiteboard instead of a blackboard to make sure things are suitable for you, and really just kind of like helping in all different accounts to help facilitate a successful kind of educational experience for you on a day-to-day basis. And this intervener, so and again, Debbie, your intervener she's the same intervener with you every day, every school day for 16 years. Is that correct?
Yeah. In a lot
Wow.
of ways, I saw her more than my parents, just being, obviously you're in school all day. By the time you get home, you might be home by yourself for a few hours, then your parents get home from work, and then, it's nighttime and you're back in bed. And so, in a lot of ways, growing up, I saw her more than, my own family.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm sure that's like you form quite a bond with someone that you spend that much time with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's really difficult to explain to people that kind of relationship because in English we don't really have a word for it. She wasn't really a friend, not really a coworker. It's really difficult to explain what kind of relationship we had.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you're saying like thinking that there's not even a word for it is so interesting. I mean, maybe Brian, maybe you'll be the one that comes up with the new appropriate term for what that kind of very unique relationship is. Um, and so again, just because I'm just really fascinated by this, because I don't think there's many people in their daily lives who again, because it's like you said, because there's no word for it. I don't think there's a lot of people that have someone in their lives in that capacity. I mean, again, it's someone that you in many ways see more than your parents or your brothers. I mean, I grew up with a twin brother, a fraternal twin brother, Al, who, if you're watching right now, shout out to Al. But even like having a twin brother who I shared a room with for a lot of my childhood, perhaps didn't even see him as much as your intervener, who you're spending so much time with. And so she's with you like in every class throughout a school day, or like in every single class. Is that how that works?
Yeah, she would attend all of the classes with me from the beginning of the school day to the end. One of the things she really hated was when I was in college, I took a multivariable calculus class. I love mathematics. She did not, and so I tortured her by taking all these ridiculous classes.
I love that. I love the fact that, I mean, again, that speaks to the dynamic there, right? It's like, on the one hand, her job is to facilitate, but on the other hand, like, you spend so much time together and there's that intimacy that, like, you can't, she's also a human, who has her own, like, likes and dislikes. So it's like, oh God, these advanced math classes again? Are you kidding me? Like, what am I supposed to do here? I mean, I love that. I mean, that would I can imagine. I do not have the facility for math that it sounds like you do. So I can imagine if I was in her position struggling a bit as well. But I mean, do you feel like, did she learn, is she a better at math as a result of being your intervener for so many years?
I don't think she would say that. Mathematics, it's a lot of problem solving and having the problem in front of you. One of the interesting things about interpreters is that oftentimes they can't even follow the conversation because they're interpreting so fast. Shout out to the interpreters who are interpreting this. And they're interpreting so fast that they don't even know what they're actually interpreting because their brains have to really quickly switch between one language into another. And an interpretation is not the same thing as a word by word translation. In a lot of ways, you have to get good at explaining what's going on. You have to be able to take a sentence in English and make it so it makes sense in sign language. It's a really difficult job, and we expect them to do it at the speed of someone talking, and that's really difficult.
Yeah, no, that's really well put. I mean, I know maybe it's the New Yorker in me, but I can sometimes get into the habit of talking quite fast. So I've definitely, been more cognizant of that when there's an interpreter involved to try to not be as New York in the speed in which I speak. But Neelam, who's watching, and she's one of the board members for the NFADB, the National Family Association for the Deafblind. She writes in the chat here, she's writing, having a great deafblind intervener who is not scared to represent and advocate for your child is a huge help for a deafblind student and even their parents. And Neelam has 2 children herself who are deafblind. And then she continues saying, sometimes we have interveners who are scared to represent and speak up for the child, fearing their job or their own job security. Is that something that you had ever experienced or heard of yourself?
Yeah. Can you repeat the question real
Yeah,
quick?
sure. The second part of what she wrote was sometimes, she said, sometimes we have interveners who are scared to represent and speak up for the child, fearing their own job security.
Yeah, definitely. So in Debbie's particular case, she never felt afraid to speak up for me. My parents knew her from back. She actually started out as a teacher at the Boston School for the Deaf, so we were familiar with her before we started working together. When she was hired on as my intervener, so my parents never felt like she would never stand up for me if anything happened. But I've definitely heard of cases where interveners and interpreters in the classroom who would decide not to stand up for the child if you know if they're being bullied, if they're being bullied by a teacher, and that's a really scary scenario to be in. I've heard of children who are deaf being moved into other schools on account of that because the parent no longer felt like the school had the interest of the child in mind, and that's really depressing. Luckily, there's a lot of great, wonderful schools out there like Perkins School for the Blind that always do the best thing for the child.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it sounds like in all things, you can have someone who's really well suited and does a great job, and sometimes people who don't in any field. It sounds like, given at least I'm imagining the length of time you spent with your intervener Debbie, that you two, that she was a good match.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm gonna hold for one moment here. We're gonna do an interpreter switch. And all right, are we all set there, Alyssa? Good to go. Excellent. So, as we continue the conversation here, if you're watching and enjoying this, please hit the share button on Facebook so that other people can join us for the second half of this conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, you can copy and paste that link, send it to someone you think might find the rest of this valuable here. I know I've learned a lot about interveners. First of all, what they are, and certainly the intimate relationship they have with their. I guess when you say, I guess you wouldn't say student. What would you say with the intervener and the what's the other side of that? What would you say? Not because they're not your student, but they're your. Again, I guess we're figuring out the right. There aren't really great words because it's such a unique relationship, but yeah, that was such an interesting vein of conversation there. But kind of
I get student.
Yeah, maybe I guess student, right? So continue on here. So again, your intervener Debbie was with you throughout college. You were talking about some of the intense math classes you were taking, but what else? What did you major in college? What was that?
Yeah, so I actually have a double major in economic and philosophy with a minor in German. I started out as a math biology double major and kind of slowly transitioned toward economic and philosophy. I had to take a few courses in German in order to fulfill my language requirement, so I kind of continued on with it and got a minor. My intervener Debbie recommended that I learn German because it's one of the easiest languages out there to learn if you have a hearing loss, because all the letters are pronounced. It's very easy to follow, although a lot of the sounds are very harsh.
Yeah.
It's got a real harsh CH sound that they use a lot. It's probably one of the ugliest languages out there. I don't think anyone would deny that, but it really a wonderful way to meet other people and travel around. And I studied abroad in Germany and loved it. So it's been a great tool for me.
That's so interesting. That I didn't know that before you said that German is like very hearing loss friendly language because it's so everything is pronounced so acutely. So I guess again, like you said, it's not the prettiest language per se, but one of the positives of that is that it's easier to hear.
Yeah, definitely.
That's interesting. And it sounds like you took all the easy majors in college with economics and philosophy and minor in German, and before that math and biology. Just really just coasting along there, it sounds like.
Yeah, I really enjoy learning. Obviously, that's kind of how I became a teacher. I just really enjoy learning new things and challenging my brain to learn new things, and so I'm just really fascinated. One thing I love is languages. I think because I started off at a school for the deaf where everything was in sign language, then moved to public school where everything was spoken in English. And there's so many misconceptions between the deaf community and the broader public. And so that really got me to thinking about how languages change our perception of other people. And so I really enjoy learning languages because it's a way to connect with other people.
Yeah, I think also like I'm curious about um, the teaching part that you just mentioned, being a teacher. You've obviously there's been a couple incarnations of you as a teacher, but can we talk about right after college what you were teaching?
Yeah, definitely. So right after college, I got a job as a um, paraprofessional, and then in the evening, I teach high school math. I taught remedial math, so getting the student up to where they should be given their grade level. After that, I went to a different school system and taught high school math full time. I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, as my vision got worse and worse, it got harder and harder to teach high school math. Um, as you can imagine, a lot of students still use pencil and paper to write out problems and erase things and move numbers around. That got really difficult to read, and it became almost impossible to grade students' homework. So I ended up leaving that job just because the challenges I faced. There were other challenges as well, just um, from trying to manage the classroom. So I ended up leaving there. I started at the Carroll Center for the Blind, which is the rehab program for adults with vision loss, and they started teaching me all the skills that I really needed. Things like Braille, using the long cane. They taught me how to use a Braille display. They taught me how you JAWed with the text to speech software program. So if I had known those things prior to leaving my job as a high school math teacher, I could probably could have stayed in the job and continued teaching as a blind teacher. But because I had left, I ended up transitioning to teaching assistive technology, and that's what I teach now. I work at Perkins School for the Blind, teaching assistive technology. And assistive technology, what that means is teaching a lot of these technologies that help enable people with disability to access the same technologies as everyone else. So, for example, I mentioned JAWD, which is a text to speech program that allows me to use a computer. It'll read aloud everything on the screen. Braille display will do the same thing. Instead of it being spoken aloud, it'll translate it into Braille so you can read it using your fingers. And obviously, the simpler magnification program, things that allow you to zoom in and zoom out. There are also color contrast program. So, for example, if you open up a Microsoft Word document, you get the really bright white light with black lettering. For a lot of people with certain visual impairment, the bright white light is too much on their eyes. It starts to hurt their eyes. So they actually prefer a black background with either white or yellow letters. It's a lot gentler on the eyes. And so I teach assistive technology for the career launch program at Perkins. On top of teaching your assistive technology, I also teach a lot of software programs that those assistive technology interact with. So as I mentioned, like Microsoft Word, we teach Google Doc, Google Sheet, and so on.
So just like to go back to as a high school teacher for a moment. So you mentioned that as your vision loss increased, it posed some additional challenges, and it was kind of time to move to a different space and ultimately become a teacher at Perkins. But you also mentioned like some of the dynamics in the classroom are maybe a little challenging. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. Just from a mobility perspective, as your vision deteriorates, it becomes really hard to travel around and feel safe traveling around because you trip over things. So learning orientation mobility really help. As far as managing the classroom, if you miss certain things, certain behaviors, those things start to escalate. A student misbehaves slightly, they realize you didn't notice it, then they start to escalate the behaviors a little bit. And so, as a classroom teacher, you really want, some teachers say that they have eyes in the back of their head, and they say that because they're constantly watching the class and making sure that people were behaving and that the classroom is running smoothly.
Did you find that as best as you can speak to your experience that your students at that high school treated you any different than they would any of their other teachers?
For the most part, no. They were wonderful students. I taught AP Calculus, AP Statistics, and an Algebra 2 class. So a lot of them were very well-rounded students who did really well in school and were focused. And so I never felt like they treated me differently.
And so now, back to Perkins, where you're currently a teacher. Can you tell us a little bit more about Perkins? Because I know I've heard about Perkins for quite a long time. It's definitely like a well-known institution, but I didn't really know a lot about the specifics until talking with you. Maybe you could share a little bit more about Perkins.
Yeah, so Burton School for the Blind is the oldest school for the blind in the U.S. and it dates back to the 1800s. It also has a really rich tradition in deaf blind culture. Perkins is known for educating the first deafblind person in the world. Laura Bridgman came to Perkins. She was deafblind. She lived in New Hampshire. And so she really broke the soil for everyone else in that she proved that a deafblind person could be educated. Prior to Laura Bridgman, nobody thought that someone who was deafblind could be educated. She herself actually taught Annie Sullivan how to sign, and they were close friends. And later on, Annie Sullivan went on to teach Helen Keller. And all three of them were students at one point at Burton School for the Blind.
Wow.
Annie Sullivan, Helen Keller. Helen Keller, probably one of the most famous deafblind people out there, and she attended Perkins School for the Blind.
Wow, that's quite a rich history. I mean, especially when you're talking about the kind of the seminal names that come up in like deaf blind history. That's certainly a strong connection there to Perkins. That's really interesting. Um, so let's talk about marathons, of which you've run your fair share. Can you just talk about first off like how you got started as a runner and how long that's been like a part of your life?
Yeah, so running has been a part of my life for a long time. When I was younger, I started off playing t-ball. The first sport that my parents got me into. I hated it. I could never see the ball. They put me way in the outfield where they just hoped that the ball would never come to me, and when it did, I could never find it. Um,
You're giving me
so,
like flashbacks to some moments in Little League that were like moderately scarring, but keep going.
yeah, it was definitely really challenging, and luckily my parents let me quit that. I ended up playing soccer and basketball, which would a little bit easier because the ball is bigger than regular baseball, so it was easier to follow. Bat ball became really challenging given the speed that the ball traveled at. It was really hard to follow the ball. And then when I was in junior high, soccer got too challenging, mainly because it was really difficult to follow the ball and figure out what the lines are in the grass. The contrast is not that great having white or yellow lines in green grass. So after that, I ended up joining the cross country team, and that was wonderful because when you're running, you don't really have to follow a ball or anything. Oftentimes there are a lot of other people in the race with you, so you can actually follow them. You don't even really have to follow the path or anything. I found that to be really easy. Unfortunately, so I ran cross country through high school and kind of ran on my own through college. Unfortunately, after college, my vision got to the point where I really couldn't run anymore. And that was really difficult because I used running as a sweat reliever. It's so helpful to have that, dopamine kick after a run where you're in a great mood because you push your body and, you just ran 5 miles. So that's a big challenge to not have that kind of sweat reliever in my life as I was going blind. So I took a few years off, and then a friend reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to run a half marathon. And I was like, I don't know how to run anymore. And he was like, well, we'll figure out. I can guide you using a piece of rope. And I was like, that's a great idea. Let's try it. We were running to support two girls with Usher syndrome. They wanted to go see France before going blind. So we were raising money for the two girls. And obviously a cause that I'm willing to go to the end of the earth for. So I told them, let's do it. And we ended up running the United Airlines half marathon in New York City.
Was that one your first marathon or that
So
one?
that was my first half marathon, and then my friend Marco said, let's do something a little bit harder. Let's try and do a full marathon and see if we can do it. I said sure, and so a person reached out to me asking me if I wanted to run the marathon in Alaska called the Equinox Marathon. It's widely considered to be the fifth hardest marathon in the world, mainly because of the altitude climbs as well as the weather. The temperature can vary greatly. So we decided to do it together. The full marathon. It was my first time doing a marathon. Looking back on it, it was a little crazy to hit that marathon to do as your first one. The There were a lot of challenges. For one thing, you start off going uphill. You climb up over at their dome, which is really tall and it's really steep. You run up it, you run down the back of it, you circle back, run down it. As you're ascending up, it actually started snowing because obviously you're at a higher altitude. One of the things that I hadn't prepared for was the fact that I wouldn't be able to use my hearing aid because obviously with the wet weather, they can damage the electronic in the hearing aid. So I end up having to take them off during the race, and so we kind of had to figure out how to communicate non-verbally so that he could still guide me. The other challenge that we really weren't prepared for was the fact that some of the trails were 1 person wide. I had gotten really used to running beside him with the rope, and the nice thing about that is that you can keep the rope nice and tight, and there's a lot of tension, and you can kind of feel where he is. Unfortunately, when you're going one by one, and I had to be directly behind him, you have to make the rope longer. And so that kind of tension and that tactile feedback of knowing where he is in relation to you and knowing where you're going wasn't really there. We also played a lot of games though during the race. For one thing, we started joking that he would tell me to whip my leg for rot and duck under things that weren't actually there. So it was actually a fun experience.
There's so much in there that's so great. But like, first off, I love, right after running your first half marathon, that it's not just, hey, why don't we run a marathon? It's, hey, why don't we run the fifth hardest marathon in the world? Which sounds very much indicative of the 4-year-old who lies to his teacher so that he knows how to swim, so he can just like jump in and figure it out. But I love that. I mean, but again, that speaks to like, I think, again, it's in that 4-year-old that you talked about. But again, why you've been so successful at so many things is just that really innate sense of wanting to kind of jump into life and not being afraid to jump in head first and just figure it out as you go. And obviously you're a really smart person, so that certainly helps. But, that's so well embodied in your story as a 4-year-old, in how you approach running. But it's also really interesting to hear, I guess I didn't even think about the fact that, like, as someone who obviously wanted to be athletic and participate in athletics, that, for practical reasons, running was a really great one, given the fact that certain challenges you described about following a ball or following the pace of something, that running was something that was practical, had a lot of practical elements, and also allowed you to, again, like a heavy degree of being able to just rely on yourself. And then as your vision declined finding a crafty way to be able to, run alongside someone, with a rope and using that tactic. And, again, not quite to the degree of intimacy as an intervener per se, but certainly you want to have a pretty good relationship with and feel like whoever you're running alongside is fairly well matched with you, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of trust there with the guide because at the end of the day, their job is to make sure you're safe, especially when you're climbing a mountain. There's a lot of jagged rocks and trees, and it's a very dangerous place to be running. So there's really a lot of trust in that guide, and even for street races, you can trip over a curb. I know I got guided into a pole once, and that was before we even got to the race, and so try and shake that off and recover and continue on running. Required a lot of trust in that guide not to make that mistake again.
Yeah, totally. You talk about so much of sport is like a mental warfare, right? When you're really pushing yourself. But another challenge to add into that, again, in your case, is to really have this implicit trust in someone, and when that's like maybe even if by accident broken a little bit, I'm sure when you're running and you're trying to run a good pace and you're really throwing yourself into the race, you want to feel like you're well supported, that you're not about to like step into a pothole or run into a pole. So yeah, I could see how that could be a challenge, an extra hurdle to overcome, so to speak, if that's like in any way even accidentally violated at some point. That's really interesting. We actually have a question from one of our viewers, Claire Turbeville, asks, Brian, do you use haptics? That could be useful in your running, is what she writes.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, she says, Brian, do you use haptics? And I guess specifically when you're running as well.
So I don't use haptic when I'm running. My wife and I, we do use tactile sign language on occasion. Oftentimes at the end of a long day, when I want to take my hearing aids off, um, we'll tactile sign back and forth. You can actually see during our wedding ceremony, we were actually tactile signing back and forth between the two of us. And I don't think anyone else realized we were communicating the whole time through the whole ceremony. But we knew, and it added to the experience of a wedding ceremony, be able to communicate back and forth while the ceremony was going on. My guides and I, we use kind of like oftentimes if it's raining or snowing, we'll use kind of a tactile sign language, not so formal as haptic. Um, we do use a lot of tactile signal to make sure that we're together and we're going in the right direction.
I love that. Tactile sign language is already a really intimate form of communication. Obviously, any communication that relies on touch is a very intimate form of communication. But to have that intimacy underlined by the fact that it's happening at a wedding ceremony between two people who are about to get married is like there's something really poignant about that to me, just because it's already so intimate, and to have it happen in such an intimate moment is like a really beautiful way to be able to communicate. A lot of times, people I feel like who are maybe sighted and hearing that don't think about other forms of communication, and maybe think of it, maybe even subconsciously might have a feeling of thinking of it as like a lesser form of communication, right? Something that someone has to resort to because they can't do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes miss the beautiful benefits of it being its distinctly own form of communication, and the beautiful things that it provides that other forms of communication can. And I think that's just, you've highlighted like one specific instance in where it's like such beautifully its own form of communication that you can't simulate in other forms of communication.
Yeah, it made the ceremony a lot more intimate because we were able, chat back and forth and talk about how we were feeling about each other in the moment. So it just made the ceremony that much better.
I love that. Well, for the last portion of our conversation, I'd love to move into kind of tying some of the stuff we were talking about with ADA 30, with the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the 30th anniversary itself is in 2 days from now, on the 26th. And Before we get to that, just want to remind people who are watching. Again, we have another live stream of the Feeling Through experience this upcoming Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time. Some of you have asked in the chat, if you're already signed up with us on our mailing list, you're good to go. We'll be sending out more information there. If you haven't already, go to feelingthrough.com/register. We'll be sending all the info out through there. And I really encourage you to partake if you haven't before. It's a really special experience, a really unique experience. And if you have, you know that each one is different, and we'd love to have you back. So please also spread the word about that. You can share feelingthrough.com/register with people. You can share what we've been posting on social media about it. And Brian will be joining us again, so I'm sure you'd all love to hear from him some more, and you'll have an opportunity to hear from him on Monday at 1 p.m. So please join us there. So Brian, again, can you talk to the importance of the ADA and how it's personally served your journey?
Yeah, definitely. I was actually born in the same month and year that the ADA would sign into law. The ADA really protect my right as a person with a disability to be able to do things. So, for instance, when I was in school, nobody could say that I wasn't allowed in the classroom with my peers. Obviously, academically, I would fit to be there. So it allowed me to learn and grow alongside my peers. And the ADA also protect my ability to work, to have accommodations on the job, as well as I have a guide dog that I travel around with, and the ADA said that my guide dog's allowed to go into any public place that I'm allowed to go. So the two of us, we're very thankful for the ADA and all that it's done. George H.W. Bush, who ultimately, signed the ADA into law, he himself actually was the beneficiary of a service dog, and he wouldn't have been able to have that service dog if it weren't for the ADA protecting his right.
Wow. When is your birthday, by the way?
July 1990.
July. What day in July?
July 8th.
July 8th. Okay. Well, happy belated. I guess we're celebrating ADA 30. We're also celebrating a Brian 30, right? So it's double 30 celebration there. But yeah, no, that's so well put. And, again, in having the opportunity to speak with you today and getting to, talk through a lot of your life as someone who, again, is that 4-year-old just jumping into the pool, and you've brought that kind of spirit and to many aspects of your life. Someone who's obviously an extremely intelligent person, and someone who's not afraid to throw themselves into life. You're obviously someone who's well suited to be successful in so many environments, but it sounds like the provisions that the ADA laid out just allowed for a better landscape for you to use all your talents in. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, definitely. The ADA allowed me to be fully included in school, fully included in work, to be around my peers. And ultimately, what that has allowed me to do is live a life that I couldn't imagine pre-ADA. Currently, I own my own house. I'm married. I take care of my guide dog. And, I have this happy little life that I couldn't imagine without the ADA.
I love that. That's certainly a great way to be celebrating the 30th anniversary. So yeah, with the last minute or so here, I'm wondering, is there anything you'd like to add that we didn't touch on today?
Yeah, definitely. I'm still currently running and training, and I am training for a rock on Cape Cod coming up in September. I'm hoping to do a mini triathlon sometime soon. I've talked to my guides, and they're all on board. So I'm excited for what the future brings.
Wow. And would that be your first triathlon?
Yeah, it will be my first triathlon. One of the most difficult aspects is going to be the swimming portion because I can't wear my hearing aids. I'm not 100% sure how that peak will go, but uh, we always find a way. The the secret sauce to life that I've found is, figuring out how to make things work for you. One of the things that my intervener taught me when I was young is, you can do anything. You just gotta figure out how to make it work for you.
Well, those are perfect words to wrap up this episode with. I'd say we have to have you back soon, but I'm gonna have the pleasure of speaking with you again on Monday, so I'm really excited about that. But you'll certainly have to let me know when that triathlon happens, because I want to talk to you again after that, because that sounds like it's gonna be. I'm gonna want a full update on how that goes. That sounds really exciting. Um, so yeah, Brian, thank you again so much for joining me today. You're really an awesome guy, like, and just all around, and have so many interesting things to share. I really appreciate you coming on here today. And of course,
Thank
thank you
you.
to, by extension, thank you to Perkins, who you're also representing today, for joining us. Certainly, thank you as always to Helen Keller Services, our partner in this, and to our interpreters, our captioner. Thank you to all of you tuning in again. To sound like a broken record, but it's an important part of the record to play again. Make sure you tune in on Monday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time, the Feeling Through Experience. It's a free event. We've had over 3,000 people join us on our last 2 live streams from 35 plus states and 10 plus countries around the world, all of which were extremely enthused. It's so much better to have so many of you join us, because that chat box lights up with so many awesome messages and questions that you have. So make sure you join us. Again, for more information, go to feelingthrough.com/register. You can also find various things on all of our social media. We're at Feeling Through on all the things. And please really do share it with anyone that you think might find it valuable. It's free for everyone, and we want as many people to join as possible. So yeah, thank you everyone. Have a great weekend, and see y'all on Monday. Bye.